Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in a first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. All right, everyone, we are welcoming Jonathan Silver to the show today. He's the CEO of Affinity Solutions, a company specializing in consumer purchase data for analytics and marketing. Jonathan, when you and I first met, the first thing I think that we hit off was we know survey data is important, but we heavily weight the value of behavioral data, so what people actually do. Can you set the foundation for our listeners in what Affinity does and the rich behavioral data you guys have for retail?
Sure. Happy to do that. It's great to see you, Leiden. So, our data represents 18 billion transactions annually. So it's a massive data set, and it really reflects exactly where people shop, when they shop, what products they're buying. It's a massive data set, and it really is the authority, the source of truth for consumer spending. We have today over 200 investment firms that use our data to make investment decisions because it correlates so well with publicly available data. I think the next most valuable data set, products built in our data sell for 3 times as much because of the quality of the data. We have almost every major consulting firm that uses our data to inform their consulting programs, their professional services engagements with their clients, from Deloitte, McKinsey, Bain, Accenture. A number of the agencies use our data to inform media investments for their clients, from Omnicom to Publicists, et cetera. We have a relationship, as you know, with the National Retail Federation, which is the largest retail association in the world. We are their exclusive source of consumer purchase insights. So we are really, in many ways have become the standard for consumer purchase behavior.
And that's, to me, this is so exciting. To a researcher, this is an unbelievable trove, because I think of the best way that you can understand someone's values is looking at their calendar and looking at their wallet. And then you get a really good picture of where they're voting with their dollars. And there's just so much that you can actually glean on that. But it didn't always start that way. I'm curious, because I've heard you tell this story in a few different places, but I'd love for our listeners to hear. How did you come from a potty training product to powering retail insights for all these consulting companies and for the NRF? Like, what is that? What is that journey?
Yeah, so it's when I tell people it all started with an inflatable potty.
Doesn't it always start with an inflatable potty?
Every good outcome starts with something involving going to the bathroom. We it's sort of that story, Steve Jobs, when he gave that famous speech at the Stanford commencement, where he said, looking forward, it's kind of very unclear your directions your life takes. And we all know he was unceremoniously removed from Apple, and then he started Next, and that didn't work. So his journey obviously is very different than mine, but it was the point that he made was that it was very difficult until you look backwards where it all makes sense. So the inflatable potty story is I, worked at McKinsey, and I decided after that job that I was unemployable and decided I wanted to start my own business. And while I was very attracted to any business direct marketing at the time that allowed us to use data at whatever form to predict response, right? So you test and learn. We were involved, I was involved with several products, and one of them was this inflatable potty. And the product is used for, if you're a parent with a young child and they're a toddler and you're on the road and they got to go to the bathroom, you pull this thing out, 2 puffs, and you've got what looks like 2 fused donuts with a bottom, and you put a liner, like a kind of a doggy poop bag, in it, and the kid does his or her thing, and that's that. And that product took off. It was one of a number of products that we had, and because we were selling it direct to the consumer, I started getting orders from people, mothers with young children primarily, and I started seeing a pattern. And the pattern was that they were buying 10 at a time or 20 at a time. And I started reading these letters that they bought one for themselves, and then their friends saw it and they thought, wow, this is cool. I'll just buy them for my friends. And I started seeing this dynamic of, the sort of sociological observation is that new parents are hungry, desperate to connect with other parents. And they happen in this case to connect around a need that people with children in that age range had, which was, what do you do when you're on the road and your kids got to go? So I started to ship it out, but I started to realize, well, wait a minute, maybe there's a way to create a membership organization for parents that was sort of like AARP in the sense of offering discounts on products, and in this case, access to unique products as well, but also allowed parents to come together and network. And we created all these benefits and services, ways for parents to meet. We actually had workshops in different cities. We had content that we would provide around different needs that new parents had. And the core of how we make money was selling merchandise, unique products like the bubble potty, we called it, and also advertising over time. So we launched that. We called it Mother's Network. And to make that story short, it was not successful. The model was to get parents to sign up, kind of like AARP, which is an organization for seniors, to pay a membership fee. We tested $9.99 and $14.99 and $34.95. But the acquisition cost of getting a new customer was greater materially than the membership fee. So we had to make our money selling merchandise or selling advertising. And the reality is we didn't get there. We didn't get to scale. I didn't have the funding to kind of keep going and eventually getting to a large enough number of members to make that work. So we were sitting there. It was a pretty bleak time, to be candid, where I was sitting there with kind of the assets of that entity, which were all these really cool benefits and services for parents, but a business model that did not succeed. And I started to go down a different path. And I said, well, what if we take that bundle of benefits and services and go to banks, insurance companies that didn't really have a whole lot of emotional content to their relationship with their customers, very transactional, and brought them this rich set of benefits that they could then deliver to their customers, and we would private label, or better said, co-brand it. So we relabeled it Family Network. We took it to Prudential Insurance, to Capital One Bank, and really the bank started to like it. I remember the first deal we made with Capital One, we said, we'll create the Capital One Family Network. You, Capital One, will give it away to your customers that happen to have children, and that will deepen your relationship with those customers, and you could use that to then upsell and cross-sell other services and benefits. And that was successful. I remember they wrote us a check for, I think, $387,500. I remember that check to buy 50,000 memberships in the Capital One Family Network. And so that was successful. We were effectively wholesaling it instead of going out and signing up members one by one. And that was a lot better model, getting paid $5 or $6 per membership versus trying to get a consumer to sign up and pay $20, but paying $40 to acquire them. But then the bank started to say, well, this is great. You have this thing for families with young children. What about senior citizens? What about college students? Can you create programs for them? And that's where the term Affinity Solutions came, because Affinity kind of referred to people's passions, interests, what floats their boat, their life stage and lifestyle. So we created these different bundles to add on to the family bundle for seniors, college students. I remember one was for outdoor enthusiasts. So we started going into lifestyle segments, and Chase Bank called us up and said, hey, we just acquired a credit card portfolio that used to be the REI credit card. REI is an outdoor retailer, but we no longer can use the name REI on the card. These people signed up for something that offered them value in the context of their outdoor lifestyle. So we created this thing called Outdoor Privileges with discounts and benefits for hiking, climbing, canoeing, and signed up 140 retailers to offer discounts on things that you need when you go on an outdoor trip. And we created a travel planning program. And during the course of planning your trip through this web-based application for travel planning, we would allow you to, check off what you didn't have. If you had the backpack and the stove, but you didn't have the sleeping bag and the tent, we would show you where you could go to get sleeping bag and tent at a discount. So we created this set of these different Affinity Solutions. But then something interesting happened, because all the discounts in each of those bundles were in the form of coupons. And I'm sitting there working with these banks, looking at the center of gravity in these banks was their rewards programs, the points and the miles and the cash back. And I said, well, what if we took these retail relationships where we got them to give coupons bundled into these different life stage and lifestyle segments, and we could figure out a way to do it in a way that aligned with their rewards program. So you would get cash back automatically, click here, link an offer from a retailer, Home Depot, to your card, go shop at a retailer and automatically get cash back. or if it's a miles or points program, get more points or miles. And that took off, right? And in fact, so much so that the banks said, this is such a great idea. You're helping to make our rewards program differentiated because they were all kind of the same. And the reason why they were mostly the same is because the banks could only afford so much out of each dollar of spend to fund a point or a mile or cashback. Here we were saying, we're going to bring retailers to fund your rewards program. They have much bigger margins, so they could afford to give 5, 10, 15% back versus the typical 1% back you might see on a credit card rewards program. So they
Yes.
loved it so much that they're like, you know what? All that life stage lifestyle stuff is great, but we really just want this thing over here where you're getting retailers to fund the rewards program. Well, that technology to implement the automatic provision of the cashback or the points when a consumer just used their card at a retailer that they're getting a reward at required us to get all the data from the banks. Because unlike what most people think, the banks actually don't know which transactions are Home Depot, which transactions are Walgreens, or for that matter, REI, an outdoor retailer. And we had to build the technology to identify or tag the transactions to a retailer. Because if you don't do that, how do you
Yep.
know?
Very difficult. Right.
So we went through that process and signed up thousands of banks, all of whom gave us their data. That then led us to realize, wow, we're running this really cool new thing we called merchant funded rewards. And then we realized the data is really where the value was. We were kind of going to retailers as part of our value exchange and bringing insights, but it was the feedback we were getting from retailers like, could you use this data outside of this walled garden rewards program? Could we use it for other things? Could you use it to give us insights on our business? Give us visibility on what's happening outside our stores and websites. Allow us to make our marketing more efficient by connecting the data. So over the next several years, we built the next extension of our business model, which is bringing data solutions. Why would the banks give us that permission? They gave it to us because every dollar of revenue we generate from these data and insight solutions, we take a big chunk of that revenue and we deliver it back to the bank's customers in the form of high-value offers in that rewards program. So it's been this incredible journey. Today, we're a $100 million company. 90% of our revenue comes from these insights and marketing solutions. Of course, the loyalty programs is the source of that data, but every dollar of revenue we generate from the data products goes back to cardholders for the use of their data.
That's amazing. Have you ever heard the story of Stone Soup?
I haven't. No.
Oh my gosh. Your career is exactly the parable of Stone Soup. So the short of it is this. There's 3 monks and they're going into this town. The town is absolutely ravaged by war and all the people are afraid in the town. And one monk says to the older monk, what makes people happy? And he said, I'll show you. So they go into the town. Nobody's looking outside of the windows. And he was like, watch this. And he gets a big bowl out and he says, we're going to make stone soup. So he takes some stones and there's a little girl looking at him. And she's like, what are you doing? He said, I'm making stone soup. Do you have any salt? And so she brings him some salt and she says, look what these guys are doing. They're making soup. And then they bring a little bit of carrots and then another townsperson brings some water. And then now another townsperson brings some onions. And eventually all the townspeople start going out because they're each sharing a little bit of what they had. And they end up making stone soup for the entire town, and everybody shares that soup.
Love
And
it.
I really see your career as the same because you're just kind of moving throughout these different entities and bringing value to the retailer. You're bringing value to the banks. In the end, it's bringing value to the end consumer who's a recipient of these rewards. But ultimately, now we get a better picture of the economy. So the other piece of value is now we're making better decisions on behalf of consumers because we're able to see how they're voting, which is
Absolutely.
It's so cool. It's so cool.
I love the stone soup analogy. I'm gonna borrow that.
I tell it to my kids. I tell it to my kids all the time. Well, let's transition. Like a lot of the people that are listening to this program are usually in the strategy or in the marketing function, research functions within retailers. So I know that you guys are doing some pretty special things with the NRF. Can you give us kind of the lowdown on your partnership with the NRF and why people might be interested in seeing some of these different economic indicators that you can get through Affinity Solutions that are beyond the basics like disposable personal income?
Sure. Yeah, we started that journey. It was sort of serendipitous, kind of the same theme of the whole journey we've been on, one of our salespeople just reached out to the NRF a few years ago just to see if their members, the retailers, would be interested in accessing our insights. And that relationship, I think it's probably 2.5 years old now, went into directions that I could never imagine. NRF is National Retail Federation, is the largest retailer association in the world. And the N is a little bit of a misnomer because they're actually expanding beyond the U.S. It's no longer just national, it's international. They have a big conference like the one they have at the Javits Center every year in January in Paris, in Singapore, and I think there's one coming up in Dubai. NRF initially was very excited as they got to know us about using our data for a lot of, big chunk of what they do is comment on the consumer spending as obviously the underpinning of the retail economy. And they were, for decades, using the source of information for their forecasts was from the Census Bureau, from the Department of Commerce, puts out every month for decades what they call the Monthly Retail Trade Survey, which is a survey of 13,000 businesses, and they roll that up, and then sometime in the middle of the month, they reveal what happened in the prior month. I mean, think about that. A survey of 13,000 businesses seems pretty archaic. Here they were looking at Affinity with, at the time, 100 million credit and debit cards that they could get access to anytime, not just once a month. They could slice and dice it by demo and geo and lots of other ways and look at it ultimately by subcategories that were not available through the census. So over the course of a year, they tested our data. They saw how well it correlated with the census data and ultimately switched from the census data to Affinity as their source of truth for all of their macroeconomic work. And then they brought in CNBC, with whom they had a relationship. And we formed a three-way partnership to launch, which we did in November of 2023, what we call the CNBC NRF Retail Monitor, powered by Affinity Solutions, which every month on Squawk Box in the morning, and I think on other shows throughout the day, they announce with, the CNBC NRF Retail Monitor, the month over month and year over year growth or decline, hopefully growth. And by category, Steve Leisman, who's their senior economics reporter, kind of owns that, presents that. I was on Squawk Box in November of 23 with Matt Shea, who's the CEO of the NRF, and Steve Leisman announcing the partnership, and periodically I'm told they'll have me back on. So that's the first layer of the relationship, is just the macroeconomic view that our data provides. As we went further, we saw the sort of next tier, there's actually two tiers, which is now bringing our data solutions to the members of the NRF. And I remember I was asked to present at the NRF board meeting early 2024 to 28 of their board members. These are the largest retailers on the planet. The CEO of Walmart US, John Furman, Furner, the CEO of Target, Brian Cornell, the CEOs of Macy's, Dick's Sporting Goods, Old Navy, the largest retailers on the planet, which was pretty daunting. But at that point, I kind of stepped back and I'm like, you know what? Our data can solve problems for retailers that can't be solved anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Not just retailers, but restaurants and travel hospitality companies, or it can solve problems that we can solve in a way that no one else can. And so that was the purpose of the presentation to the board, is here's what we're going to do next. We launched the monitor, which is macro, and now we're going to launch a set of solutions. The first layer, which is free to members, is the data broken down by category and geo. But the real benefit was to access the data at a very granular level by retailer, by demo, by geo, by trade area. That launched at the NRF conference this past week, I think week and a half ago at the
It's pretty fresh.
Pardon me?
That's pretty fresh.
Very fresh. And it was really well received. We had Walmart on stage, Dick's Sporting Goods on stage, and the leadership, the guy that runs the insights and research work at the NRF. I had a meeting with Matt, the CEO of the NRF, and he made a point to say, look, we had a board meeting. This year's board meeting was the Saturday before the NRF show, and there's only 3 partners we talked about. You, the company that's helping us expand into Paris and Singapore, and a third company. So we are the exclusive provider of consumer purchase insights to the NRF.
That's really good. And so, you guys sell into hedge funds, you sell into different consulting companies, but there's obviously, with this partnership with NRF, you see a lot of value in retail research. So what are the functions within these retailers that typically resonate the most with your data?
Yeah, it's funny. During the pandemic, I think it really became clear to retailers and restaurant chains, QSRs, travel hospitality companies, that the primary source of data that they were using for insights, which is their first party data, their CRM data, was unreliable for obvious reasons. People stopped coming in to stores and restaurants. And even the e-commerce business that was growing was very unpredictable. So the visibility that our data provides, it became very clear that that's table stakes. Without visibility on what's happening outside their stores and websites, they were going to be at a significant disadvantage. And to your question, if you look at the retail organization, it's real estate. Where should I open stores? It's, more broadly speaking, how should I allocate my capital? I'm seeing that I'm growing faster in Chicago, and I'm seeing that I have more headroom there. So I'm going to put more dollars there versus New York, where I've already got a lion's share of the market. Merchandising and inventory optimization. Our data is used for forecasting because of the demand signals baked in that can be then help with inventory optimization and supply chain. Of course, media and marketing, where our data, because it's matchable, and this is probably the most significant, we can go on and on about the data itself and its granularity and its predictability. But the reality is to turn it into action. And this is a huge part of why we're excited about you guys, Spatial, and Persona Live and other partners, is our data is matchable. It can be connected not just to demographic data, but we can match it to the retailer's first-party data. Probably most importantly, we can match it to media data, so IP addresses, mobile advertising IDs. And why that's important is, if you see, for example, that, you're Home Depot and you're losing share to Lowe's in Chicago. Okay, that's a problem. Thank you. What do I do about it? With our data, we can help steer you towards media opportunities, TV shows, audiences that have a high presence of buyers and a high level of spend of Lowe's customers so you can win them back, as an example. So there's a whole set of media and marketing applications where, because it's matchable to media data, we can help them target their ads better in programmatic or connected TV. We can help them measure their ads better, which is a huge focus. Measurement has historically meant, in the world of, let's say, TV advertising, how many eyeballs watch a show and what their age and gender is. But what about outcomes? What about being able to predict the likelihood that people are going to buy your product, which is where the point of advertising, or at least a big part of it, in the first place? So if we can help you avoid the John Wanamaker problem, which everyone talks about, half my advertising is wasted. This was the John Wanamaker from Wanamaker's department stores. Half of my advertising is wasted. I just don't know which half. The more we can reduce that waste, the better. That's a big part of the opportunity that we have in retail environments, is to turn those insights into media optimization. Where can I allocate my dollars to drive the most return on ad spend?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can get the insights, but you need a clear path to activate on it. And that's what is unique, I think, about your guys' data set and why we definitely loved it. I'm curious for you, have you seen any counterintuitive insights for retailers that you've had work with your data?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. We were working with one of the consulting firm partners at the time, together with McDonald's, and McDonald's was losing share. And they assumed it was to Burger King or Wendy's, but they just assumed that because that's historically been the case. When the market share declines, it's typically to hamburger chains that compete directly with them. Well, it turned out when we looked at our data, it wasn't either of those. In fact, it wasn't a hamburger chain at all. It was Popeyes. And around 2019, Popeyes introduced the chicken sandwich, which people tell me is amazing. And I think for whatever reason, the share of stomach of McDonald's customers started to shift from McDonald's to Popeyes because they really were excited about the chicken sandwich. So that was a unique insight. It turned out McDonald's introduced their own chicken sandwich eventually, but we, as I said earlier, we were able then to say, you know what, we can help you direct your media dollars to those media options and TV shows that have a high presence of Popeyes customers to win those customers back. Maybe you can tailor the creative. Even though you don't have a chicken sandwich yet, you can highlight menu options, chicken nuggets or whatever that might appeal to people who defected and went over to Popeyes to come back. So that was one of the observations. Another one was some work we did with Kroger, where they also were seeing some share shifts going on, and they assumed it was other grocery chains like Publix and Stop and Shop up here in the Northeast. Well, it turned out a lot of it was to QSRs, people that were picking up a meal on the way home that they could pick up from a quick service restaurant, as well as the food service areas within Target, Walmart, and other mass merchants. And as a result of those insights, Kroger really expanded and invested in their food service area so they would recapture some of that lost share to the QSRs and to the food service areas of the mass merchants. So those are a couple of examples. I could go on.
I could thank you for the last one because before we have kids, my wife and I would go to Kroger for our dates because they had that little food service thing. They even had some wine, and I remember a guy playing saxophone there. So it's cool to hear that full circle. Some of that insight came from you, which is really cool. I also think it's interesting when you have people looking at the data and then they see, okay, this is what I consider my competitor. I'm a chicken restaurant. I consider chicken restaurants my competitor. That's obvious, right? But then you can start to look at the data a little bit differently and saying, what if my competitors are actually the same companies that have a similar frequency of visits as my restaurant, which it might be a burger restaurant, it might be Chipotle, or what if my competitors are the same competitors that have a similar ticket size to my restaurant? Because ultimately we're looking for that vote. We're looking for them to vote on our company, and they're voting similarly over here. So that is a pretty cool insight I think that you can have. Is there any other human insights that maybe made you laugh or that you see with the data that are just you find interesting?
There was one thing that we saw where we were scratching our head in the data where we saw a bunch of people that the pattern was a bunch of back to school spending over a couple of years. So obviously they have young children. Then we would see a furniture purchase, and then we saw a high correlation of alcohol. Liquor store spend after that. And so we were like, why would that be? And then we were sort of speculating that, you have kids, you're meeting parents of other students as part of your new social network. You're visiting homes you haven't previously visited. And you're like, okay, it's time to, because, there's a high correlation of fixing up your home after you have kids, but not generally right away. I mean, there's some things you do right away, but there are some things that have a lag. And now you're like, all right, well, I have new furniture. I've fixed up my home. I'm going to invite some friends over, and I'm going to buy some alcohol. So that was the speculation, but we did see some unusual correlation between school-age kids, furniture, and then alcohol. By the way, you reminded me of something when you talked about ticket size. We did something years ago with 1-800-Flowers where we noticed that one of their competitors is Teleflora, and they had, for whatever reason, a category. I mean, you typically buy one item when you buy something from a Teleflora or 1-800-Flowers, and they had a category, a price point that was present in the Teleflora sales that were not present in 1-800-Flowers. They just had a category of flowers that fit a certain band of price point, and 1-800-Flowers didn't have it. And as a result of that insight, they ended up introducing another set of products that fit that price point that clearly they were missing. So there's many interesting examples where we can influence merchandising as well as media, that being the example of the former.
Another one of the things that I've seen with your data, I believe this just to be true generally, and something that excites me about the research that we do is a lot of retail, physical brick and mortar decisions are based on two things. One is trade area modeling and looking at the data within that, but there's also mobile data, which is a big part of it. So looking at the mobile phone visits to our location, one of the things that mobile phones miss is not every visit is as valuable as the other visit. Just because a mobile phone visited your store doesn't mean they bought. Just because they bought doesn't mean that they bought a lot. And one thing that I think has been cool that we've been able to see about your data is that we have minority type segments, primarily minority type segments that you would assume would not spend a lot of money on a particular retailer. Not true. Not true at all. There's some level of affinity to that retailer where they have a super high ticket size, and the reverse. We have some really high income segments that for whatever reason, they do not value retail in the way that you would normally expect someone to value retail. And so we're treating all these folks demographically as the same or making some assumptions based on their disposable income, which isn't totally true. And it is beautiful when you get the stories.
Yep.
When you actually say, okay, this is what is actually true. And this can explain some of the anomalies that we see in our store fleet.
But I've seen the work that you guys are doing in that area. And, that's the persona live segmentation you guys have kind of cuts through the typical demographic segmentation that people have done. And it's so mind boggling that so much of the TV work, for example, that Nielsen and others, just say, okay, well, here's the demographics, age, gender, females with between that, 18 and 35 that have these household incomes. It's pretty archaic, to your point, because are these counterintuitive examples where you don't expect consumer behavior. So I think what you guys are doing, taking our data, I tell stories about partners that I think are taking our data and doing some really cool things. And what I love about this business is working with really innovative partners like Spatial.ai who can take the embedded insights in there and turn into something that's never been done before.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, let's transition to what happened in retail in 2024 and what that might mean for us in 2025. You guys get a very unique view of the sort of the macro retail system that's going on. So analysts say that consumer spending in 2024, basically it was above expectations. What were the categories that you saw overperform and what were the ones that did poorly this year?
Yeah, no, great point. I also think the way we look at it is it's looking at the year, but it's really the trends as we ended the year, because that really is, from our point of view, what is most predictive about what's going to happen in 2025. And as I look at, overall, the year was strong. I think it was up 4% against 2023. But as I look at the end of the year, we saw, holiday spend, which is a little strange this year because this year, unlike most years, Cyber Monday occurred in December. So it was a little bit November,
short season.
Short season, but also normally the whole holiday season from Black Friday through Cyber Monday is self-contained within November. This year, Thanksgiving was very, very late. It's the latest possible date it could be. And that pushed Cyber Monday and the Sunday just before that into December. So you really had to look at November and December together. Despite that, November year-over-year was pretty good, and December was significant. It was 7.24% total retail year-over-year in December, 8.4% in what they call core retail, which is minus autos, auto, gas, and restaurants. So we really liked the way the year ended. That was the most encouraging thing. And then as you asked about categories, home furnishings is one area. And for whatever reason, I got the home furnishings industry years ago asked me to come and do a keynote. And I've done it every year. And I have a place in my heart for the home furnishings industry because they're mostly family-owned businesses, from the largest like Ashley Furniture to like Bob's Discount. And they've been so impacted by the pandemic. There was a huge amount of furniture purchases during the pandemic, and then they've really been suffering. But the good news is we're starting to see at the end of the year, furniture purchases going up. I think end of the year was up 5.3% year over year, which is a great bit of good news. So I'm really happy for that. Electronics and appliances, which got really hurt earlier in the year, we started to see an uptick in the latter part of the year. December was up 10.2% year over year. Clothing and accessories show another bright spot, up 14% year over year, 4% month over month. So those are some really positive things. And look, the dynamic from a macroeconomic point of view is really the interplay between unemployment rate, which is still pretty low. It ticked up a little bit, but it's still pretty low. Wage growth, which has been exceeding the rate of inflation, which is good. Even though inflation has been persistent, it's come down in terms of the inflation rate, but the prices are still high. But wage growth has exceeded inflation over the last couple of years, which is very positive. As long as that balance stays the same, I think 2025 will be great. In terms of other sectors, let's see what I can share.
Well, I want to make sure I understand the levers there. So you're looking at this three, which is unemployment, or do people have enough money? Are they making any money? Two, wage growth. So we just need to make sure that this is eclipsing inflation. Where those are the three things that kind of predict whether retail will be looking good or bad.
Yeah, I would say there's a fourth thing, maybe a fifth. The fourth, which is no longer a factor, is, believe it or not, the excess savings that accrued during the pandemic from the stimulus checks and deferred spending for a while people were locked up. Believe it or not, the excess savings, as the economists call it, didn't get depleted until last kind of March, April. So that had been a backstop. So that part is taken away. And then to your question, jobs, unemployment, wage growth, and inflation, The only other piece is obviously interest rates, which impact inflation, but interest rates on its own also impacts the cost of borrowing for consumers, which obviously, home buying is a big driver of the economy, obviously a driver of home furnishings and home improvement. So to the extent that it's harder to, afford a new home, that is going to have downstream impacts. But yeah, those four things are still in play: inflation rate, wage growth, unemployment, and interest rate as a standalone and also as a driver of inflation.
And we can kind of pontificate and I don't know if you have any thoughts beyond just the numbers here, but you've got home goods went up. Great, because I heard that's a sector that was obviously down. Nobody's moving. It sounds like electronics and appliances were up too. Do you have any sense on why these were up at the end of the season? Because I've heard the theory that people are expecting tariffs, and because of the expectation of tariffs on those things, like, okay, let's buy it now. Do you think that kind of explains why those things were up, or is there more of an optimistic reason why we might expect that?
Yeah, I've heard the tariff argument. I think there's some of that. Yeah, there's some of that, but I don't think it's an overriding thing. I think it is reflecting of consumer confidence. I mean, let's not forget there was an election. We'll try to avoid any, third rails on a political discussion, but there's a large portion of the country that is, that in any election you're going to see an increase in spend. If you're a Democrat, you're feeling a little depressed. If you're a Republican, you're feeling more confident. And I think on the folks that are confident, I think that is fueling some additional spend towards the end of the year. My personal belief is that the tariff, this is a separate point, the tariff thing is a little bit of a red herring. I think it's negotiating posture, and I think ultimately it's not going to be nearly as bad as people think. But I think the real thing is people's consumer confidence and belief that the economy is on the right track, regardless of your political beliefs.
So I think you talked a little bit about the macro economy. It's okay if you don't have this data or you didn't look into it, but we saw some spending's kind of gone up. But if you slice and dice the data, is the story different among different income or age cohort?
That's a great question. Our belief has always been, and it's a belief that's supported by data. We don't live in a single economy. We don't live in a homogeneous economy. We live in multiple economies, and income is probably the most significant way to segment the consumer population when you look at consumer spending. Also age and generation, Gen Y, baby boomers, et cetera. But income is critical because 50% of the total spending by consumers is from low income, and we define low income as as under $100,000 a year. So 50% of consumer spending, and consumer spending is 70% of the total economy of GDP. 50% of that 70% is low income, and without a strong spending from that, you drive the economy with just high income folks. And the good news is we are seeing a pretty strong spending from low income for much of 23 and a big chunk of 24. The low income folks were increasing their spend year over year at a higher rate than high income folks. So that's encouraging. And we are hopeful that will continue. It is a precarious balance, again, between wage growth for the low income, particularly for wage growth versus inflation. As long as that balance is maintained, and it could be upset with tariffs, it could be upset if the mass deportation happens, because that would decrease the availability of labor, and it would increase the average cost of labor because a lot of the immigrants are doing work at a lower hourly rate. So those two things could upset that balance, tariffs and mass deportation. But my belief is that won't happen to the degree that it would need to happen to really upset the apple cart. As long as the wage growth is greater than inflation, we should be in a good spot for at least the next, call it 6 to 9 months.
I love what you're talking about, where you said we don't have one economy. In fact, we have multiple economies going on. And I often will hear people say, the economy's up, the economy's down. And sometimes my reaction to that is that is much too simple of a way of looking at that question, because it's not equally distributed. And there's so many fascinating stories playing out against different geographies, different demographic groups, different interest groups that play into this, and especially at the brand level. I think that becomes pretty important.
Absolutely.
So how are you seeing consumers balance inflationary pressures with their discretionary spending? Are you seeing any brands or any categories where people are trading down, or is this staying pretty standard?
Yeah. So I talked about furnishings because we tend to look at durable goods as kind of a bellwether for the economy. Another category is food service and grocery. Restaurants and grocery tend to be somewhat inversely correlated, right? You go out dining out versus dining in. And I think we've seen a lot of fluctuations. The best performers in the category are understanding using promotion and marketing in a smart way. If you start with the premise that we don't live in one economy and looking at income as one variable, price sensitivity is critical. And particularly in an inflationary environment, even though the inflation rates come down, the prices are still high. Retailers and restaurants in particular that use promotions to drive people in. And if we're talking about segmentation, there's a world where with AI, there'll be a more systematic way of doing personalized pricing. But just using the types of segmentation that Spatial.ai has, leveraging affinity data and other data sets and other players out there, the best restaurants and retailers that are succeeding the most are knowing how to apply discounts and promotions by segment in a really smart way. If I know that you're highly price sensitive because you're low income, but as you pointed out earlier, sometimes you can have a low income person, but psychographically, they're not that promotionally sensitive as you might think they would, and someone else who's got high income may be promotionally sensitive. If you can score someone as likely to respond to a discount and then apply those are the retailers and restaurants and travel companies that are succeeding the most. And we're seeing some really good examples of that. Brinker is one company that we're collaborating with, which is Chili's as an example. So I think the smarter, more data-centric companies are seeing some really good value. Here's one interesting story I will tell you that, there's a lot of retailers that actually don't know who their customers are. They may have a loyalty program, but it may only capture a small portion of their customer base. In that small portion, they'd have the name and address, or at least the email address of the customer, and they can do some appending of insights, demographic and perhaps other types of insights. But even those companies, the vast majority of their customers aren't in the loyalty program. All they see is an anonymous transaction. They don't know that it's Leidenfaust. It's a $22.80 transaction on March 3rd at 10 a.m. in the morning, but they don't know who it is. So we figured out a way to match the transaction data of the retailer from these unknowns, or these unknown knowns. What is it? Known unknowns, sorry. People that they know they don't know. And we are matching to our data on transaction attributes. The dollar amount of the transaction, the date and time, the location. We know who the person is. For privacy reasons, we can't hand that identity over, but we can take all of those identified, what they bought, that fact that they bought at that restaurant or retailer, and what they bought, and we can create all these really cool insights that are cohorted that they would never otherwise have. And some of them can be basic demographic insights. And then, of course, because we have the full wallet of spend of that customer, we can give them all these purchase share of wallet insights. So that's an example where really forward-thinking restaurants and retailers that are really focused on segmentation are using Affinity to expand the portion of customers that they know, which for many restaurants and retailers, they don't know who they are.
Yeah, and I think people, that's a little bit surprising when they think about Affinity. They might be thinking about, okay, what are my competitors doing? But thinking about how it can augment your actual first-party data is also really powerful, and definitively too. Like, this isn't probabilistically like these group of people. It's really like that person is matched, which is really cool. Well, maybe as we talked a little bit about tariffs, talked a little bit about the economy in 2025. Maybe as we kind of close this out, this is more of a question for me to you, CEO to CEO. Less about retail. When you think about your 20 years at Affinity, and you think about the different levels that the company has been at, like the different crossroads, how's your leadership had to change in those different levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, you can appreciate this sliding as a CEO founder. At least for me, I would say I had to learn how not to micromanage. When you're starting a business, you don't have a lot of room for error, and you're passionate about the product and service you're delivering, and you can't always afford the best talent. Fortunately for me, I was able to bring in some great people early. But I think as the company's grown, and as I said, we're $100 million of revenue, we have 160 employees. I've had to change my leadership style to be less, micromanaging, trust more, delegate more. I think I somewhat succeeded in that several years ago, and we'll continue to, you start seeing where something's not working well, and then my instincts start to kick in where I start to drill down and try to solve whatever problem seems to be happening. But I think that's one big piece of it. It obviously is a function of bringing in great people so you can delegate and trust. Culture is extremely important. I think we made some mistakes early on where we probably should have gotten, let some people out of the team that were culturally misaligned with what we were trying to create. And just because they were producing a lot of business, sometimes you're like, well, yeah, they're difficult to deal with, and they're creating a lot of negative energy, but they're bringing in all this business, and that was a big mistake that I ultimately changed. And just all sort of the organizational structure and organizational design. We're even going through that now as we head into the rest of 25 to organize the business differently than you would when you're a smaller company. We're organized by vertical now, where we have folks focused on media marketing use cases, such as this partnership with Spatial, someone else focused on consulting firms and the investment companies that you mentioned, someone else focused on financial institutions. So it's a little more, distributed, vertically oriented organizational design versus purely functional, where all salespeople and all account management people are reporting into that one function. So those are some examples of the changes that we've gone through.
It's a hard balance with micromanaging, because there's also I don't know if you've seen the stuff on the news about this, but it's a big couple of months ago, Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, the founder mode. If you saw that conversation, so his kind of point is like, I know when you're the founder, like you actually really got to get into this stuff and look into the detail. But obviously, Brian Chesky's not doing every single thing in the company. There's a balance there. It's like you can't completely be hands off, but you do have to be involved to a point, but also empowering those members. And I think that's what wisdom is when there's a cliff on either side of these things, and you just got to make your mistakes until you get the wisdom. And I'm not there yet. Like I got another 10 years to catch up with you on the length of the company.
By the way, there's a really good book that I'm not a big book reader because I don't have the time, but of business books. But somebody recommended a book about Jensen Wang from NVIDIA called The NVIDIA Way, and it's kind of similar to Brian Chesky in the sense. I mean, both of them. I think Jensen has like 60 direct reports, and so kind of violating what I was just saying. And I think Jensen both don't do one-on-ones, as you probably saw.
Yeah, Amazon doesn't either.
Yeah, and I'm sort of like, what? Imagine how much time I could free up. I don't do a ton of them, but I've always wanted to keep a flat organization. So there are people throughout the companies, particularly who've been here a long time, that have enjoyed the direct connection to me. And I've kept, a monthly one-on-one with a lot of those, skip level down, 1 or 2 levels down. I'm sorry, 2 or 3 levels down. It gives me a pulse of what's going on. But I think, what? The thing that kind of struck me with Brian and Jensen is, you get so much more done when you have a bunch of people in the room. Someone, bitches and moans about something. Well, why not have the person in the room that can help solve the problem instead of me just being a comforting ear to them? And then maybe I'll help them behind the scenes. I can understand why Brian and Jensen would want everyone who's most relevant in the room to kind of deal with and address a problem that someone shares versus relying on one-on-ones.
Well, Jonathan, this has been awesome. My last question for you, for the retailers or the research folks that are listening to this, what is the one question that they should be asking in 2025 that Affinity's data can help them answer?
Well, I think it's situationally specific. I mean, what I get excited about is one level below the macro stuff, is how can our data solve problems for retailers that can't be solved anywhere else? And it starts with that visibility. One thing we didn't talk about earlier was Amazon, right? And, we continue to see them capture share. On Prime days, they take more share from certain retailers like Walmart than they do others. I think it's really looking like I think the most value from our data is the share of wallet and visibility that provides. And if anyone on the call or on the podcast is either a retailer, we working with Spatial can provide visibility on market share. We can identify competitors that you don't maybe know that you have. There's emerging competitors. And then the insights to action is, what can I do about it? And I think we can translate that into media plans, but there's also a big area, which is customer experience, which we didn't talk much about on this podcast. But I think where we see the biggest opportunity going forward is with researchers really digging into how can I create a feedback loop with Affinity data to test and learn in media, test and learn and customer experience, and then seeing how that changes the share shift and the persistence of customers that try the retailer out for the first time. We love to look at repeat visit rates, like someone that goes one time, what percentage of those go a second time? Our data can show that. And what percentage of the second timers go third and fourth time? That's a pretty important measure of brand health, is, stickiness and repeat visit rate. So those are some of the things that I would say our data can be helpful with.
Cool. Thanks for coming on the show, Jonathan.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.